What do you do when you realize you've royally screwed up? What do you do when you realize you've screwed up? Audrey and I this week did a couple-day trip to Boston and did a whole bunch of things, saw a game at Fenway. It was awesome. No, I'm not a Red Sox fan. We went and did some museums, went to some Harvard stuff, did all sorts of fun stuff. But we went to this one place on the advice of basically everybody, the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum. If you've ever been there, I hear some mumbles. Yeah, this is a wild place. This was a woman who was rich beyond imagination and very eclectic, let's just say. And so she built this palace and outfitted it with famous furniture and art and tapestries and music and religious emblems and all sorts of things. And she basically threw it in this palace, wherever it landed, that's how it is. And so you go to a normal museum, I go to museums a bunch, and you go into one and this is all the Renaissance era, whatever. And you go over here and this is all the Byzantine, whatever. And you go to the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum and yes, it is all of that all at once. And so you get one thing, you first walk in, one of the first things you see is a Roman sarcophagus with Renaissance art set on top of it and a tapestry behind it. Look at this masterpiece. So it's a wild place. But then you go into a couple of the rooms and you notice something that stands out. There's empty frames on the wall. And first you think, yeah, this woman's a little out there, so maybe it's just empty frames on the wall. But then you learn the story of the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum, and you learn that in the early 1980s, they were warned by the FBI. Hey, there's some chatter out there. We've heard that there's some people, they kind of know your security routine, or as the case may have it, the lack of your security routine. They know where you keep the stuff. They know when the guards go on break. They know all of this stuff. So maybe you ought to change it. Maybe you ought to improve it. Maybe you ought to do something different. They don't, but nothing happens. Years go by. Maybe they forgot they were warned. Maybe they just yeah, no. But then in March 1990, some people came in the middle of the night, tied up a couple guards, made out with 13 priceless pieces of art. It's the largest art heist ever. It's never been solved. We don't know where these pieces are. We don't know if they still exist. We don't know anything about them. All we know is that they cut the art out of the frames and left the frames sitting on the floor. So you can imagine these curators, these security people, when they show up the next day, first off, they see their buddies tied up. So they're like, okay, I'm going to untie you. And then they notice these empty frames on the floor. And if it's me, I'm going to hide these things, because they realize, oh, yeah, we've been warned about this. Oh, yeah, maybe we should have done something different. What do you do when you realize you've screwed up? What they did was they hung these frames back on the wall. So you go and you see these 5 frames and there's nothing behind them. And when you read about why the curators did this, there's 2 reasons they generally give. One is it's a reminder of when they really screwed up. Right? It's clear evidence. There used to be something here, something happened, and it's no longer here. Security failed, curators failed. We messed up. And we're not going to hide that. The other reason they give is because, like I said, this art's never been found. It's never been sold on the black market. We don't know what happened. And so these curators talk about one day, we may get this art back. One day, these pieces may be restored. And so we're going to leave these empty frames up here as a reminder and as a hope that one day it could all be put back together. What do you do when you realize you've screwed up? Luke's gospel is full of stories of people who've screwed up. We've heard a bunch of them these past couple of weeks. We hear another one today. To understand today's story, we have to remember last week's story. And so I'm going to give a little refresher on what happened. Jesus is sitting around having dinner and drinks with tax collectors, sinners, prostitutes, life of the party kind of people, right? And the Pharisees, the keeper of the laws, the figureheads of Israel, all the important people walk in and they're like, what is this guy doing? And so Jesus tells them stories. And y'all remember these stories. He tells a story about a shepherd who lost a sheep. And he left the proper sheep to go find the one that wandered off. And then he tells another story about this woman who lost a coin. And she left the righteous coins to go turn everything over and find that other coin. We heard those stories last week. The other story he tells right after that is of a son who said, Dad, I wish you were dead. Give me your money. I'm going to go off because I know better than you. We all know that story. And so this young man goes off, spends all his money, wakes up one morning in a pigsty, and asks himself, what am I going to do when I realize I've screwed up? And so Jesus tells these stories, and you can imagine the Pharisees start to look at each other. Who's he talking about? Am I that guy? Are you that guy? I know you're that sheep that wandered off. I know what... The Pharisees are trying to figure out who's who and what's going on. And then Jesus, in today's gospel, in the same breath, he turns to the disciples. Our gospel starts off, and then he said to the disciples. So you can imagine the hubbub over here, the Pharisees and the people. They're trying to figure out what Jesus was talking about. And Jesus turns to his friends, and he says, there's a landowner, a master, and he had a steward. And the steward realized he screwed up. And he goes on to tell this story. And here's the hint. This is not Jesus' best business advice. If you paid attention to the gospel, please don't do this in your workplace. I will come visit you in prison. But that's not what this is. Because you got to understand, the way Jesus uses these parables, the way Jesus uses what he's talking about, is the moment he said there was a master and there was a steward, the disciples knew what he was talking about. If I come in here and I talk to you and I tell you a story, imagine a story, there was an elephant and there was a donkey. Are y'all wondering, okay, what kind of zoo story are we talking? No. Y'all know exactly what I mean if I tell you some story about an elephant and a donkey. This worked the same way for Jesus. So the moment he says to the disciples, there was this master and there was this steward. Their ears perk up and they know, oh, he's talking about the master. He's talking about God. That in ancient Jewish literature was a common thing. They knew, okay, there was this master that had wealth beyond measure, that had everything. Obviously, that's God. And then when he said there's this steward who was given charge over all of this, the disciples heard, okay, he's talking about Israel. He's talking about the people of God. That was language they knew. And then he goes on to tell this story about how the dishonest manager, the steward, is told he's going to lose his job and realizes he has screwed up. And so he does something about it. He goes out there and he goes and finds the people and he says, what do you owe? You owe 100. All right, make it 50. All right, what do you owe? You owe 100. All right, make it 80. Scholars have argued about this. Maybe like in the story, the steward was like padding his income. And so, but that I think misses the point. Because again, this is not a business lesson. This is a gospel lesson. The steward wakes up one day and realizes he has screwed up. But in our gospel, we find out he goes back to the master. He doesn't run away. He doesn't hide. He doesn't pretend he hasn't screwed up. He goes back and he throws himself at the feet of the master. And here's the thing. The master who was about to fire the guy. The master who said, give me an account. You can't do this anymore. When the steward realized, I have screwed up, but I'm going to come back to the master. The master sees him. The master commends him. And the master entrusts him again. If you're like me, you know all the ways you've screwed up. If you're like me, you know all the ways we've squandered what we've been given. If you're like me, you know all of the empty frames in our lives. And if you're like me, sometimes you want to hide. Sometimes you want to pretend you have it all together. Sometimes you want to pretend like it doesn't hurt, or like it doesn't bring shame, or like it's not real. Because if you're like me, sometimes we forget that God's grace and love and mercy is bigger than any of our failures. That doesn't make our failures not real. We're all living proof of failure. We can't escape it. But we're also living proof that God still loves us. God still trusts us. Look at those first followers of Jesus. Peter is in a couple of weeks going to deny that he ever knew Jesus. He is going to fail. And then a couple days later, Jesus is going to say, Peter, on you I'm going to build my church. I know you failed, but I trust you. And then maybe a couple years later, Paul is going to go out there and start killing Christians, and he is going to fail. And Jesus is going to say to him, Paul, I want you to take my love and my grace and my mercy around the world. I could tell you about all the ways I failed, but I know y'all want to get to the Cowboy game. So I'll just say I have, but God still trusts me to stand up and remind you all. God still trusts you. So what do you do when you realize you failed? What do you do when you realize you failed? I hope you return to the Master. I hope you hear the Master say, I still love you. Amen.